I have a really important question about this. Were Kade and I murder hobos or the social ones?
You guys were the murder hobos. You went straight and said, hey, there was no long discussion about should we talk to them?
Welcome to the Encounter Table, where we discuss game design, dive deep into how to make your encounters interesting, and build encounters for you to use at your table. I'm your host, Ryan.
I'm Ralf.
I'm Kade.
So today we're going to start with the question, what makes an encounter interesting? I started the website www.tabletop-rpgencounters.com just really to beat down this question. How do we make an encounter interesting? So Kade and Ralf, can you talk a little bit about what's like one or two things that comes to your mind when you think of an interesting encounter in a tabletop game?
I think for me, when it comes to encounters being interesting, what I find really helpful is when we talk about motivation, because once I know what my motivation as a player is, or once I know what the motivation of the NPCs that I'm running in this encounter is, I will have already a good idea where it goes. And with that, I can build something that has some direction, and having a direction will make it easier to control where we're going, and that helps make it interesting. Nobody wants to have an encounter where everybody is just running around like a chicken with a head cut off.
I think what makes encounters interesting for me, I don't know the word for it, maybe the stakes of it, what are the consequences of your actions, what happens during the encounter. I really like systems that have the mechanics of the yes, but, or the fail forward type is what they're called. What the player's doing, even if they fail, can move things forward.
So I spent quite a bit of time thinking about this question, and I wrote probably 3,000 words on it because that's what I do when I think about something. And I came up with this framework for how to think about different things you can adjust in encounters. And this is by no means a definitive, these are the things you can do for encounters. But when I started to think about how do I make an encounter interesting, I came up with these 6 things that you can sort of adjust. So the 6 things I kind of identified that we can adjust in an encounter is the goals, which short term is what are the goals of either the PCs or the enemies. The mode. Now, a mode is a style of play. We'll probably talk mostly about the 3 modes that you see in a lot of games, which are social, combat, and like skill type challenge things. But depending on the game, you can have a bunch more. If you look at a game like Shadowrun, I would argue there's probably 10 different modes. If you look at the magic system and the working in VR, the Matrix, those are like you're playing a new game each time you jump into a new area. Stakes, what you were saying, Kade, what happens if we fail this encounter? Why does it matter that we're successful? Tension, which this is kind of D&D centric, and depending on the game, it might not be as important, but what's pushing the players forward? Why can they not have the 15-second workday? Agency, which in the article I called choices with impact, but it was actually Ralf when we had our conversation the last time, made me change this word. It's like, what are the choices that are in there for the players, and how do those actually impact what's going on? And then finally, mechanics, which is how are these things being reinforced with the actual rules of the encounter or the game that you're playing? I think it's sort of obvious as I go through the list that a lot of these are going to bleed into each other. You're going to use mechanics to enforce the tension. The modes are going to affect the agency that players have. If you kind of go through these things and think about each one, we can make encounters much more interesting. What I'd like us to do now is we're going to go through each one of these things again, and then I think each of us will talk a little bit about an encounter that we've made or that we've been in before where that particular element has maybe made it interesting. I'll start with one. So I think one of the my favorite encounters that I've run, and this one is also on the site, had to do with goals. My PCs were in a new town, and the town was run by sort of a crooked, well, not crooked, but a gang, a bunch of thugs. So I ran an encounter where my relatively higher level PCs at this point, I think there were like 8 to 10, encountered a group of thugs. If you know D&D, the usually other human NPCs are pretty low level. But what I did is instead of having them just attack them, I made the goal of the thugs to kidnap one of the PCs. So they knew which PC would be the one that would go down the quickest. They poured everything into that one PC. She got knocked out, and then they started picking her up and just running away with her. Now, the PCs were able to get her back, but the whole point of that encounter was completely shifting what the PCs were trying to do. Rather than, oh, we're just going to get into a fight, it was like, oh, wait a second, we better get this person before they dive into one of these nearby sewers, because then what? You know, we're going to have to get this person back. And I think it was a way of choosing some easy, low-level enemies and making the threat much more palpable.
And that is a big issue with the PCs just going in, and like you said, mid to high level PCs just like, you know, rolling over a challenge. But if you change the behavior of the villain or the thug, then that upends the usual outcome, the expected outcome.
I'm going to pick up mode here because when it comes to mode, I think one of the things we can do as a GM in the preparation phase before we run the encounter is that we can think about the 3 different modes, or at least 2 of them, how a situation could go down. I think social is somehow in the middle, unless there's no other person around in a skill-based mode, for example. But if I come to a situation where I should use skills, but I could talk to people, I have the choice between skill and social. If I come into a situation where there might be combat, but I might be able to talk to them, I again have the combination of either combat or social. So for me, I feel that is kind of in the middle, the social encounter. I like to have 2 options open. My first online encounter, or my first online one-shot that I ran, in that whole encounter we have hobgoblins, one of my favorite ones, because everybody thinks they're so easy, but they're actually not too dumb. They are actually quite clever, and you can play them clever. And I played it with 2 different groups. One group saw the hobgoblins and went straight on murder hobo on them and said, yeah, we gotta kill him. The other group that I played it with, they were like, let's wait a minute, let's get a little bit closer and let's talk to those guys first, what they're doing here. And those situations I had prepared. The combat situation is pretty straightforward. If you start shooting at people, they will shoot back. If you start attacking people, they will not stand there and say, hey, let's talk about it, unless they are really, really sure that they can take you. The social encounter was a little bit more interesting because the social encounter was built in a way that the hobgoblins will first engage in a social conversation and they will ask for your help. And once you are in the tomb, they will turn around and stab you in the back. So it was somehow built in that you could see it coming, but you might be backstabbed anyway. So I think there we have the idea that we can use different modes to come towards a similar goal when it comes into what's happening.
Well, I think there are 2 interesting things you talked about with mode. The first one is what you were saying about social being between skill and kind of a halfway point. And I totally agree, especially in D&D. I think the social mode really depends on your table because like rules as written you make a skill check when you try to persuade somebody. There doesn't need to be any dialogue. The only reason I wrote it separately is because in most of the tables I've seen and that I play at, often, typically people will describe exactly what the character is saying. You'll get into like in-person role playing. Whereas with the skill checks, it'll be more, I'll just do this thing. I'm going to climb the wall. What's the DC on my athletics check? I'm sure there are tables where social situations are just a skill check. I want to persuade them to let me do this. And that's fine too.
Well, when most people hear the word social encounter, they do tend to lean towards the role playing.
I also think that it's always good to have situations where we can avoid rolling the dice. And if we can do this narratively, if we can spin a situation in a way that we have with an NPC a good conversation and the GM says, you know what, this was so good, I don't make you roll the dice because we did a really good conversation. That NPC is sold on the idea. Why should we roll the dice? I think that's a nice outcome. You can't really do that with combat. You could, but might be a little bit dangerous.
Depends on the system. There are systems that exist where I can't remember the exact name of the system, but there are systems that exist where the narration is a big factor, like how you describe the combat.
Off the top of my head, two that I can think of right off that are that way are the Seventh Seas, Seventh Seas, the Not Europe pirate game, and then also Feng Shui.
That's the one I was
very
thinking of.
narrative based.
Yeah,
both of those it's a huge part, the description of combat. Yeah. So, Kade, could you talk to us about an encounter that you've run or been a part of where the stakes have really made it interesting?
We were playing in a game where they were at PCs were at a dinner party, and they had snuck away to open a door. And one character was trying to pick a lock, and the dice were not in their favor, and they were failing just time and time again. And so I was raising the stakes by saying that, well, I'm not going to stop you from getting through this door because that's the whole point of this encounter. You're at the dinner party to break into this room. So I'm not going to stop that. But what I'm doing is I'm raising the stakes. Oh, it's taking more time. Or there's, the owner of the house is going to come back into the room that you're in, or something like that. Like the stakes are continually raising, but I'm not shutting down what the PCs are doing. A game I've mentioned many times, and I will mention many times because I think it's really interesting, particularly when it comes to encounters, is the Blades in the Dark game. So the way that the stakes fluctuate in that game, I find very interesting.
Adjusting the stakes to the situation is something that will have a ripple effect throughout the encounter or into what comes after the encounter. The situation with the door. If I open the door right away, I have a lot of time inside the room, right? If I fail, that takes away time inside the room. That means it's not just the stakes at the door, it's also the stakes that I have inside the room when I try to look for stuff. So everything becomes more difficult.
What you have both said, which in a game, the least interesting option for failure is that the story stops moving forward, right? So in a combat encounter, if the only stake is, well, you die, game is over, pack up your things and go home, it's not a very fun possible outcome. Same thing with that skill check. If the failure of that skill check of trying to break into this place is, well, you don't get what you need to move the story forward, or a game, has an abrupt stop. So how do we change that? So tension is, again, like I think I said this already, but these things are going to bleed into each other. Tension is what is driving the characters to move forward. And I think this gets particularly important in games with resource drain. A huge D&D problem is known as the 15-second workday. All right, killed these kobolds in 3 rounds of combat. I've done a total of 18 seconds of fighting. I'm going to go take an 8-hour nap. See you all tomorrow. We'll get into the next room of the dungeon. And there's a few ways to raise tension and to keep pressing it. They can be narrative. It can also be mechanical. One really cool, really easy way of raising tension is a tool I picked up from a really cool channel called, it used to be called Drunkens and Dragons. It is now called Runehammer. And the guy who runs it, I think it's a pseudonym, is Hankerin Furnail or something like that. And he came up with this idea of a tension die. And basically what you do is you design a dungeon, and when you start combat in the dungeon, this started as an idea for D&D, and then he made it a major part of a game he made called the ICRPG Index Card Role-Playing Game, which is which is very neat. It's a game that fits on index cards. You take a D4 or a D6 or whatever, and you roll it, and you have something that happens. It's like a countdown timer, right? So you roll a 3. That means in 3 turns, you have something happening. There is some monster that is inside of the dungeon, and it's like tentacles are going to come at you in these every 3 rounds, and you have to make a check to get out of the way. Or there's some other kind of magical effect that's going on, and this is happening, between 1 and 4 rounds every single time. This doesn't give the PCs a chance to rest or relax. Like, they have to keep moving through this dungeon. You keep in turn order, and it does keep the tension up because every round they spend not moving forward. Oh, I couldn't unlock this door. Let me just try it again. Like, no, well, you can, but now you've lost a turn, and you're going to lose more resources if you want to keep trying to get in this way. You make the choice about what you want to do.
I like that idea. That's an interesting idea.
What also keeps tension up is if the players have a real goal, a real motivation to do something, they're not going to take that 8-hour nap. If there is something the characters deeply care about, they will make role-play choices that will create their own tension. And this is beautiful because then it's not anything I have to force on the players. It's something the players force on themselves, and they are highly engaged.
Yeah. Creating that motivation is sometimes difficult, though, but when it works, it works really, really well.
For me, creating the motivation is very simple. Give me a room with a bunch of buttons. We're all set. When I was a teenager, we were playing The Dark Eye. There was a situation. I was playing a young witch. I think it was one of the few bought adventures that came with a box or something. In that adventure, there were 2 children that were somehow magically gifted, and we freed them from something. My character cared about those kids because in the whole lore of The Dark Eye, witches find some sort of apprentice and give their knowledge to them. I found 2 highly magical gifted kids, so I was like, yeah, I'm going to bring them to my, I don't know, what's it called, witch coven mother or whatever. We changed the whole situation. I ran off with those 2 kids, and the group was like, what just happened? That was awesome.
All right. So I think next up is agency. I initially called it choices with impact because agency for me is about impacting the story, which this could be. When I think of things more on an encounter level, I mean, what are the options that players have in order to affect the encounter, what are the different strategies, or what are the different ways what are the different routes they could take?
I think agency is really important, even at the encounter level, because it goes to the meat of why someone makes their character the way they do. If you make your character, heavily magic centered, or you make your character heavily social centered, you want to use those abilities. You want to highlight what makes your character special in the group. And I think that agency is a lot of, from a completely player motivation, not a character motivation, but I think agency is a big part of well, what can I do? What cool thing can I do to solve this problem? The example I'm thinking of in particular is Jeff's character, it was mainly a very combat heavy game, but Jeff's character had social abilities where he could buff other players. And he used that ability in several encounters in ways that I, as the DM, hadn't thought about or hadn't considered. And I think that's a big part of agency.
So I'm going to push back on that a little bit, just about a couple of points. I 100% agree with you. You should never, ever, ever not accept something that the players come up with that you didn't plan for. To me, that's like the most exciting part of it, is when somebody comes up with a cool idea I had never thought of. The only time you say no is if it doesn't make sense with the fiction or the story, or it's particularly outlandish. But I guess when I think about encounter design, I think about what choices could the players have that will have an impact. If I'm going to make a combat encounter, what about the environment? What about the enemies? What about the things that I'm putting in front of them? Give them some kind of choice. Because I feel like if you don't, it ends up becoming, let me look at everything on my sheet. I'm going to just choose the coolest power on my sheet, or I'm going to think about how I could use a power, as opposed to really engaging with the situation.
I think it's difficult to pinpoint that agency down on that lower level. I think when it comes to preparation sessions for the next round, where you say, okay, let's talk about the next city, what could be the name of the city, stuff like that, where you do a little bit world building, I think it's quite easy to see what agency looks like there and how the players could help build the world that you're in. When it comes to the individual encounters, it's quite tricky, because you don't want to lose playing time just by figuring out what's going on. But you still want to make sure that the players do have some ideas or something that they can put in. When it comes to something like a combat, you want to do something that is a little bit more acrobatic. Okay, look around you. What do you see? We're in a dungeon. What do you think you could use? And then we could negotiate GM and players if that makes sense in that setting. But I think when it comes to agency, social encounters might be way more interesting. Just saying, maybe there's somebody else in the room. Who could that be? And then we could have a little bit more input from the players that might give a new direction.
So maybe one of the things I do need to think about is changing this back to being choices with impact, because I think the things you are both describing about agency are just fundamental to having a good game in general, and they're more of a philosophical approach to how you do everything. Your players should always have the ability to create in your world, given the right circumstances. If it's not there, it's not there. That's fine. It's okay to say no. I don't think you should always say yes, but they're going to buy into the world more if you give them a chance to play in your sandbox. I think what I mean specifically is when I design an encounter, if I'm designing a combat encounter, one of the things I like to do is to try and make sure that there are multiple avenues or multiple choices within that combat encounter. So, for example, just redoing the 10 by 10 6 orcs in a room type of a thing. You have two groups of orcs. You have a frontline group that are holding a reach weapon, which if you're not sure what that is in D&D, it means it reaches 2 squares. And the special ability of the weapon is that if you get hit by the weapon, your movement ends. And then what I did is I put behind them is I put some like casting orcs. The orcs who are casting spells are doing considerably more damage to the party than the ones who are in the front line. So you get this choice. Do we take the risk of running through these orcs who are going to stop us if we, get hit by them as we run through, but hopefully get to these guys who are really dishing out the damage and taking them out first? Or do we kind of hide behind the pillars, slowly in my room there are pillars and hiding things and other stuff, and slowly take these guys out in front, but risk taking that damage? So when I think about choices with impact, I think about what kind of information are we giving the players and what are we setting up so that they have things to choose outside of their abilities that will impact what's going on. Because while abilities are really cool, just getting to look at your character sheet, I feel like pulls you a bit out of the fiction. Not that you shouldn't look at your character sheet or you shouldn't use it, but if that's what your go-to is, like, ooh, that's where the fireball memes come from, is that all I get to do is look at my character sheet. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. And I also like that you mentioned making sure that the players don't just look at their character sheet, but also look at the situation. And then we have the combination of, okay, this is where I stand with my skills and my abilities. This is where the situation is. Here is where I have multiple avenues that I can go down. Which choice do I make? Which pathway do I start going down? And with that, I already have a certain choice. And maybe that could lead into one of the other levers with stakes and tension again, where we can say, okay, this was a choice early on, but it has a ripple effect further down the line.
Well, that goes back to the thing that I've said many times about a lot of these aspects is the consequences. What happens next? What happens next when you steal an airship in front of everyone? What happens next?
And then so the last bit is kind of mechanics. So this is usually just a reinforcement, right? So I've said you're going to have this agency, or you're going to have, this choice with impact, or there's this tension, or there's this mode. When you can enforce something totally narratively, that is a great thing to do. Like when we talked about tension, if you can take an important NPC and they've been kidnapped and that's why they can't stop moving, and everybody cares about that, awesome. But also, we will think about ways to enforce these ideas mechanically, right? We are still playing a game, and the mechanics matter.
The way we describe a situation as a GM, that will lead to some sort of reaction. If we describe something that will draw the attention of the player just towards the combat field on the character sheet, it's going to be a combat encounter. If we describe it in a way that we say there are other possibilities, people will start looking at their skill sets and maybe try to find out other ways to pursue the situation. Now in D&D, the combat area on the sheet is relatively large compared to the other areas. And I think this is where the mechanics play in. If you have a representation either on your character sheet or in the explanation of the GM that goes in a certain direction, players will go down that road. If the explanation goes in multiple ways and you get to set up a situation and encounter that has different ways, then it comes back to the group, what they decide, what they want to do. And I think this is a mechanic of a GM, how to describe something to make sure I'm not forcing a specific mechanic of the game onto the players.
I think you can force certain mechanics of the game depending on what you're doing, as long as it makes sense. And when I say specific mechanics, I guess I mean more specific modes. Very rarely is it you may only use this one skill and no other skill. When I think of using mechanics, I think of something like going through an old ruin, and all of a sudden you awoke an ancient evil up, and you need to get out. Oh man, the elevator out is broken. So the way that I would enforce that mechanically, or the way that I would think about mechanics there, is you have to make X number of skill checks hitting a certain, almost like a number of successes. Like you need 5 successes to get this thing started. And depending on how high your roll is, you might get 1, 2, or 3, right? So I'm going to do repair is not in D&D, but I'm going to do an Arcana check, right? That's our magical workhorse. You're going to need to do an Arcana check. You're going to need to get 5, successes total. In the meantime, there are zombies or, I don't know, bat creatures or whatever nasty thing you want coming at them in droves, like at a number that they cannot defeat. You're using these mechanics. I mean, and again, this comes down to where we talked about it, where everything is bleeding together, right? It's interesting because the goal is different than a normal goal. The goal is not to defeat the enemies. The goal is to get out of this room. It goes into mode where we're not just using combat as a mode. It's part of it, but we're also using skills as a mode. And then also, how am I reinforcing those through the mechanics, right? You have to get X number of skill checks. You tell me what skill check makes sense to you. And then the elevator goes up, taking you along with it. You're out of the encounter. That was an interesting point that you had, Ralf, about thinking about like what are the mechanics almost on a meta level, because there's a lot that goes into the psychology of what we choose to describe as a GM. How many times have you just wanted to throw in something random or describe something weird and the players just latch onto that thing like there's no tomorrow? And all of a sudden there's like a new character or this thing or that thing. But when I think about the mechanics, I'm thinking more along the lines of what are the game mechanics reinforcing the other choices you've made.
Well, you're going to get pushback from players on that as well. Players are going to use the mechanics to give themselves advantageous advantages, some sort of tactical advantage that does have a mechanical representation to help them fight this horde that's coming at them. Or perhaps, they're doing help actions with the elevator, which is a mechanical advantage. So, I mean, like so it's a ebb and flow, like most aspects of the game. One thing about D&D that I think is different from a lot of other systems is, rightly or wrongly, because I enjoy it quite a lot, I love rolling dice. The mechanics are in your face. They do not bleed into the background of the game.
Yeah, no, you're totally right on that. In many games, the mechanics are already reinforcing the narrative that you want to tell, right?
Yeah.
Even in some real generic systems. Savage Worlds, I would say, is pretty similar to D&D in a lot of ways in terms of the mechanics being in your face. But I would say the pulp feel of Savage Worlds is very, very in your face. Whenever I play it, I think of an Indiana Jones movies, right? It's like whiff, 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 insane critical. I mean, that's literally every scene, right? This mistake, that mistake. Oh, I punched the guy's head into a plane blade.
And that's what it does really well. I mean, it's,
So I think this time for an encounter, what would be a lot of fun is if we were to take a fairly typical encounter you might see in like a roll chart or in some older, I guess this is an older thing, you wouldn't see it as much anymore, but we'll do 6 kobolds in a 10 by 10 room. And we'll talk about ways, we'll go around and talk about ways we could use one of these levers to make it more interesting. If you all want to pull up the kobold stat block, I'm sure it's easy to find.
Well, 3 of the 6 are wearing a trench coat and are stacked on top of each other, so they look like a normal person.
Where does that meme come from? What is?
I honestly don't know, but it's all over the place. Might be a Critical Role thing, but I feel like it's older.
It's definitely older.
Yeah, it's definitely old.
I'll start with a goal, and then we'll just kind of work our way around each person, if that works.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
We could either change what the PCs do or what they're trying to do. So one thing we could do is we could say that the kobolds are guarding a tomb as the PCs enter, and these 6 kobolds know that with this like fully armed group of adventurers, they're goners. So what they're trying to do is shut a door further into the cavern to make sure that they can't get in, or that they have to go in through a more difficult way. So they don't even care about they're not even going to, they might leave 1 or 2 to be like, we are going to fight you. But the rest of them are running off to close the door. And I'll stick with that. I had a different idea, but I think I like that one.
I think that's good. I imagine it going down in a certain way that, let's say 2 of them are engaging in 1 round of ranged combat while the others get everything done, and then they try to get out. So there's some arrows or some bolts flying around. With that said, I think the modes social seems to be out of the window here. I guess this is something where mostly combat or a wider definition of skills would come in, because we might have a caster in the group that has some spell that might lay down an area effect that hinders them from moving quickly enough. I don't know, is grease something that I can cast somewhere else, right? So if I see that they want to run away and I just grease that area, they are slower. So I have slowed them down as a caster. That would give the other members in the group time to engage in a combat, or in some way trying to overcome them without necessarily killing them.
And I think what would be cool is you wouldn't even need to be a caster. I think both with that spell and this group of creatures, it could literally be a big old vat of grease. Wouldn't even need to be a spell. They just kick over some grease.
Sure.
Well, the GM did mention the barrel of lard in the corner, talking about how these different 7 encounter elements, or 6, these 6 encounter elements, the way that they feed off each other. And if you bring up the stats of the kobold, so a purely mechanical thing, it says they fight with pack tactic. They wouldn't be doing 1-on-1, and also they get advantage when they go in groups. There might be 2 trying to close the door, but then you have 4 who are just full on at you and getting mechanical advantages for being full on at you. So that would also change the motivation of those 4 kobolds.
All right, we've gone through goals, mode, mechanics, some mechanics that we use. Stakes, I think we kind of already alluded to it, but maybe the stakes are... Oh, go.
Since they are guarding something that is there for a long time, they had preparation time. And this is not just a regular door that they have to close. There is a mechanism that they just have to put on, and the door closes by itself. So they just have to push that button and the door closes. They have 1 or 2 rounds to get inside. But in those 1 or 2 rounds, the players have the opportunity to get in there too. So there might be some combat happening to keep them away. But this would higher the stakes because it's a very heavy door. Once that's closed, it's going to be really, really difficult to get through because on the other side are enemies. They have more time to prepare.
It would also be the tension thing as well.
Sorry, I was going to say, I just wanted to feed off on that. I really like that because you end up with 3 sort of different success and fail states. You have what you could think about as like a complete success where you wipe out the guards before they hit the button. You keep them from doing that, and the door is open and you can rush in and it's open, right? You have partial success where you or some of the group is inside, but the door is shut, and maybe there's not a way for the players to open the door again very easily, and now they're stuck with whatever is down in this hall. Or you have state number 3, doors closed, they need to find another way in. That's probably even more well guarded now that they've raised the alarm. But go with what you were saying about tension, Kate. I just wanted to say I think there was a lot of cleverness in there that I wanted to unpack.
Oh, most definitely. What I was going to say about tension is what is the farther goal of the characters? Maybe the closing of this door really sets them back, and they have to go around another route, and they have a time sensitive tension related to the immediate stakes of this room, but that there's longer consequences to just having this door close on them.
Let's decide what those might be.
Well, I like the idea of just having to. You've added more time. Like whatever you're doing, this is the most direct route. And if it closes, then
I think we could have something that those kobolds guard some sort of treasure with magical powers. The group needs that treasure with the magical powers. There is not enough time to negotiate because the kobolds don't really want it gone. So they decided the only way to get it is to steal it, and they need that magical item because it helps them save an NPC that is somehow attached to them. Then we have that there is a ticking clock completely out of their control. That NPC is getting sicker and sicker and sicker. They have no idea because they're not in contact. They just know the more we wait around here, the worse this NPC is. Every delay means that NPC that we care about might die, and we really need that magical item that's in there.
I think the choices with impact, I think based on everything else that we've set up, like I don't think we need to talk about anymore because they're already there, right? Either the choices are, how are they approaching the door? Are they sneaking? What's going on there? Once that grease gets dropped, do they go around it or do they go through it? Do they wait for it? Do they go safe? Or do they plow through it? And I think also they have, once that door starts closing and they know that the door is closing, do they go in or do they stay out?
Or do they try to somehow jimmy the mechanism that the door can't close further, put something in there?
So there are a bunch of different choices they could have already. That's our encounter for this week. Our next segment is box text. This is how we would describe this encounter to our own players, or how we would write it if we were to publish this as an adventure. I hope you enjoy. All of your research has led your party to this cave, where the magic goblet resides. You know without it, your friend back home is not going to make it. As you enter the dank, dark cavern, you come to an opening which is seemed to be fashioned into some sort of room. Sparsely decorated, apart from the natural moss growth, it is littered with bits of junk, some crates, and barrels. Occupying the room, you see 6 short, bipedal creatures. In the back, there seems to be a large stone frame supporting a heavy door. Upon seeing you, the creatures knock over the barrels, spreading a greasy substance on the floor. Roll initiative. Thanks for listening to the Encounter Table. If you liked what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple or your favorite podcatcher. Also, share us with your friends. We love to hear from our listeners, so please comment on the podcast at our website at www.tabletop-rpg-encounters.com. Find us on Twitter at TTRPG-Encounters or on Facebook at the Tabletop RPG Encounters page. The music accompanying our box text is Trod Along by Blue Dot Sessions. You can find their music at sessions.blue. You can find Ralf on Twitter at WudaRPG, that's at WUDERPG, or buy some of his games at wudarpg.itch.io. Kade is a real person you can't find on the internet. Remember, keep playing,
keep designing,
and always check for traps.